Can everyone view?
Looks perfect, Christina.
Excellent. A little bit longer than I had planned, but there we go. Thank you, Hugh, for that introduction, and good evening. I'm delighted to join you virtually wherever you are in the world, and a particular hello to my West Coast friends and family who I see tuning in during their lunch breaks. I'm grateful that you can join us. Having recently completed a PhD, I'm knee-deep in the job search. That comes with the usual string of rejections and frustrations and existential self-doubt. But for tonight, I get the joy of looking at objects with you that remind me of the wonderful people who found them. Here's just a few of them. Tonight's lecture investigates the carved stone fragments excavated on Holy Island, Northumberland, from 2016 to the present. It examines their archaeological context and what this can or cannot tell us about original form and function. From here, it extends the geographic remit to think about how Lindisfarne's monuments fit into a wider northern Northumbrian landscape. But tonight's talk is also a love letter to a little tidal island in the North Sea, rich with stories and stones, seascapes and seals. Some of the folks tuning in to watch right now will know this firsthand. They will have spent anywhere from 1 to 8 seasons with their head in a trench or their fingers gripping a toothbrush to gently pry dirt from bone. I've had the privilege of being part of the jointly led Durham University and Dig Ventures excavation on Lindisfarne since 2017. We dug through the pandemic years, even when that meant extra precautions were taken. I know that I'm not alone in saying that the dig was a particular lifeline through those unsettled times. In recent years, there's been overlap with some other summertime Northumbrian digs at Bamborough and more recently, Yeavering. Last September, I got to see both my doctoral supervisors concurrently digging in the Northumbrian wilds, Sarah Semple at Yeavering and David Petts at Lindisfarne. But back to our island, we know from the historical, by this I mean the textual record, that Lindisfarne was the site of a wealthy and well-connected early medieval monastic community. Founded in 635 by Aidan of Iona, the island became one of Britain's most prominent centers of learning. Its monks advised kings. Its community traveled far and wide across Europe and welcomed visitors from all over. The community of Cuthbert's landholdings were basically everything that could be seen from the island itself. And if you've been to Holy Island, you'll know that's a lot. Moreover, we know that Lindisfarne was the site of an important scriptorium. Just gonna move this out of the way. One of the finest insular manuscripts was produced on this island in the first quarter of the 8th century in honor of this island's saint, St. Cuthbert. In the 10th century, a colophon was added, telling us the names of those involved in the manuscript's production. At that time, the Latin gospel text was given an interlinear gloss in Old English. And remember the cross carpet page you see on the left-hand folio. It'll reappear. 3 dates are particularly significant to the Lindisfarne story: AD 664, 793, and 875. In 664, the outcome of the Synod of Whitby meant that Lindisfarne turned its sights from the west, that is Iona, to the south to Rome, and with this came the elevated veneration of a Northumbrian-born saint, St. Cuthbert. It's from this period that we can start to refer to the island's monastic inhabitants as comprising the, quote, community of Cuthbert. On the 8th of June in 793, the textual record tells us that Lindisfarne was targeted in the first of a series of full-scale Viking raids. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that, quote, the woeful inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne Island by fierce robbery and slaughter. Simeon of Durham vividly adds to this that, quote, they trod the holy things under their polluted feet. They dug down the altars and plundered all the treasures of the church. Some of the brethren they slew, some they carried off with them in chains. The great number they stripped naked, insulted, and cast out of doors, and some they drowned in the sea, end quote. But neither of these animated voices is actually contemporary to the events described here. These accounts are perhaps more of a reflection on the agendas of their authors and communities of their time than they are an unbiased account of past events. What is uncontested is from 793 on, coastal monasteries in Britain would experience successive raids. Iona, for example, was attacked 2 years after Lindisfarne, and again in AD 802, 806, and 825. But why would the Viking attackers have kept going back to Iona, like Lindisfarne, if there wasn't something to go back for? Or put another way, you wouldn't successively raid if you had already crushed resistance. Under an entry for the year 854, the Historia Regum Anglorum details the substantial landholdings of the community of Cuthbert. Among the community's dependencies were a number of sites up and down the North Sea coast. among them Aldhame, Abercorn, Coldingham, Edinburgh, Jedburgh, Melrose, Norham, and Tyningham. And the material culture enthusiast will note that most are sculpture-producing sites. The extent of these landholdings do not at all reflect a community struggling in subsistence and submission. By the last quarter of the 9th century, AD 875 to be precise, the community of Cuthbert is said to have finally left Holy Island, carrying with them the body of their patron saint, as well as a piece of sculpture, a standing cross. Simeon again tells us that this cross, dedicated to Bishop Ethelwald, had stood on the island through the raids. He says it was broken and rejoined by pouring lead into its cracks. While Dr. Victoria Thompson has thoughtfully thrown into question the veracity of this claim, what's nevertheless important is this fusion between bodies, body of the saint, body of the cross. It's something I think about often when studying the monument form. The peregrinations of the community of Cuthbert led to Durham. This is, of course, how we get our magnificent Norman cathedral with its shrine to him. But what happened on island, and I'm cognizant I want to make sure you can see the images, so I'll move that. What happened on island? Are we to unquestionably believe the textual records that tell us that life was practically wiped out during and after the raids? Since 2016, the joint dig ventures Durham Uni excavations on Lindisfarne have voiced a resounding counter message. Life did indeed carry on, and with vigor. For the past 8 going on 9 years, we've been predominantly digging to the east of the Priory in what appears to be a lay cemetery that's in use before, during, and after the Viking raids. And we know that this is a lay cemetery because we're finding men, women, and children, not just men, as one would expect in a monastic context. We've unearthed numerous small finds. Here's just a few items. Stykas, which are Northumbrian coins predominantly from the 9th century, bone comb fragments, a Nefeltoffel game piece, and 2 rings still affixed to their finger. And my favorite is in this photo that I took right after it came up out of the ground. You can see that the rings have oxidized the finger, turning both the rings and the finger a somewhat unshading shade of turquoise. And the image on the upper right hand of your screen is a drone shot showing the location of our most recent trenches in September 2023. And I thank Nat Jackson for this photo. 3 seasons back, we started to locate some unusual burials in our eastern trench. A chest burial with its lock plate still intact. You can see the inset image, abutting what I've marked here as a possible shrine or focal burial. Last year, we unearthed a number of neonatal and children's skeletons in the areas surrounding these graves. This makes one wonder if people were specifically burying their infants and young children in proximity to the individuals in these special graves. A piece of porphyry of the type which make up Irish portable altars was found nearby. Last year, the paved surface was excavated further, again revealing particular investment afforded to the area near these burials. Last season, we also got our first prone burial, meaning that the deceased is interred lying down rather than on their back in supine position. While it can be tempting to view this as a, quote, deviant burial, there's many other explanations, and we're just awaiting the results of the lab work to learn more about this individual. Most of our graves are filled with quartz pebbles, which you can see in an image on the right. We find hundreds and thousands of them, each brought with care and respect to the site and placed within or upon the graves. Dr. David Petts just recently confirmed a date for the big ditch underlying many of our burials and stone features. Importantly, the animal bone samples from both the primary fill and recut date to the early medieval. We're talking mid-7th to the last quarter of the 8th century. David is hesitant to term this a vallum, so we're calling it a substantial boundary feature of some sort. Nevertheless, it's giving us clear evidence of early medieval phasing. We have a ditch followed by some structures, followed by burials, some of which were probably contemporary with the structures. One of these structures, in the West Trench, is a lovely early medieval drain. We know it's early medieval because it's cut by a later kiln, which would have been used to create the Norman priory standing behind. And here I direct any questions on this feature, the ditch, and the wider chronology of the site to David Petts, who himself is giving a talk on Lindisfarne in person tonight to a local archaeology group. He's seen the C14 dates come in firsthand, and we all wait on Facebook with bated breath whenever he has a new batch to share. I also direct you to David's 2021 SCA lecture, handily available on YouTube. It engages with the wider archaeological context of the site and the excavations that had taken place through that year. A quick Google search will also throw up other more recent talks given by David on the Lindisfarne excavation, so you can watch our progress through to this year. The Dig Ventures website also provides numerous tools for engaging with the excavation, including photogrammetric models of the trenches and some of the finds. Both sources are helpful for thinking through the multi-phase nature of our cemetery site, burials cutting burials, and a site that's actively being utilized before, during, and after that 793 date. But now we come to the main theme of this talk. A number of early medieval sculpture fragments have been located on Holy Island by the early 20th century. Most of these had presumably come to light during two phases of clearance work in the late 19th century. None, however, is given a clear context or find spot, even when one returns to look at the antiquarian records. The left-hand cross-shaft fragment on this slide was located on the grounds of the priory, quote, sometime before 1893. That's the year that we first see it in a publication by Hodges. This near complete namestone is said to have been found in February of 1915 during clearances in the north transept of the priory. Even this oft-cited figural fragment is completely decontextualized, first mentioned in 1924, but with no known find spot. The namestone circled here is also said to have been found in 1924 on the shore at the southeast corner of St. Cuthbert's Island. The lovely animal-inhabited interlace of this cross-shaft fragment was also presumably found sometime before 1924, as it's then mentioned in a publication. The year 1924 keeps popping up. Architect turned archaeologist Charles R. Peers had been digging on Lindisfarne and Whitby in the interwar years. His publications, seen here and note the 1924 date, offer nothing really in the way of contextualizing the sculptures. Most often, it's unclear which fragments actually come from his excavation and which are just surface finds. The closest we have to a properly recorded sculpture is this cross space on the left-hand side of the screen. Peers records it as being, quote, possibly in situ under the northwest pier of the Priory Church. No dimensions are given, and its present condition is, rather unhelpfully, unknown. I've circled this cross space in a poor, very dark, early 20th century photograph on the left-hand, as I said, the left-hand side of your screen. Another cross space in color on the right-hand side is first mentioned in Peers's publication, but it's unclear if it was found in his excavation or whether he was just the first to document it. It sat within the Priory's east end until recently. It's now cleaned up and inside the new English Heritage display on Island. We'll think about a Peers excavation again when we look at a recently found sculpture piece. I've shown all the above because I want to emphasize the lack of context. This fits in regionally. About 63% of all extant high cross fragments are contextually useless, however harsh that might sound. They are not built into a datable structure, for example, reused in church masonry, nor do they even have any sort of monument biography. So our Lindisfarne fragments aren't alone. Furthermore, relatively few early medieval sculpture fragments have been found in excavation at large. I show here some graphics I produced during my PhD, which just focus on the high cross fragments. While this doesn't include all sculpture types, high crosses are by far the most numerous monument form in central Britain, an area which of course includes Holy Island. Here's a closer look at all high cross producing sites in central Britain. Note how few sites have had their fragments found in excavation. And I'll note that a dot only means at least one fragment has been found in the excavation, has been found by excavation. As a result, our excavation is the first to properly record the find spots of Lindisfarne's early medieval sculpture. Can you see the fragment coming out of the earth on this slide? Here's what it looked like when it was cleaned and photographed, and thanks to Edwin for the photo. It's a namestone, a type of monument we'll think about in a moment. Most of our sculpture is found in rubbly upper layers, presumably crushed and moved about during years of plowing and sanctuary close. Here are a few random pieces of stone. Number one is some sort of molding, perhaps architectural or else part of a relief slab. Number two is probably part of a lamp or sconce, and it has its carbon deposits still surviving in the interior surface. And there are certainly parallels for this type of sconce at the early medieval monastery of Hartlepool. Number three is a whetstone, and the pizza slice shaped fragment labeled number 4 is tooled and possibly is a fragment of a namestone, but it's anyone's guess. But the most interesting finds, at least for Sculpting Lindisfarne's early medieval story, include the namestones and cross components. A namestone is a small sculpture piece about 1 foot to 1.5 feet in length. On Lindisfarne, they are in the form of a red sandstone rectangular block shaped with a rounded top. They are probably our earliest form of early medieval sculpture on the island, dated epigraphically to the 7th and 8th centuries. Namestones are found at a handful of other northern Northumbrian sites, among them Hart, Hartlepool, and Billingham. The term, unsurprisingly, comes from the fact that the monuments contain an inscribed personal name, presumably of the deceased. The inscriptions are usually in Old English, though sometimes in Latin or runes. They are very special finds in the sculpture record because it's rare that we get any sort of individual names on early medieval sculpture at large. The names are most often bounded by an incised or relief central cross, which creates 4 quadrants, within which the inscription is laid out. As Professor Jill Hamilton Clements has pointed out, the names are usually divided syllabically on either side of the central cross. The slabs are generally edged by a border. As our title slide showed, the namestone that Chris, who I think is tuning in tonight, found has the most glorious interlaced border. The relatively unworn nature of namestones has been the topic of much debate because it throws their function into question. It seems pretty clear from Jill's work and their find spots in our excavations that namestones can broadly be associated with funerary contexts, but this does not mean that they were grave markers. My PhD similarly argued that the transnational archaeological evidence does not support a grave marker function for high crosses, but that's another topic entirely. We have yet to find any in situ namestones on Lindisfarne, as in related to a specific grave. For example, a headstone, a footstone, a pillow stone, as we see in the later medieval world. An exception to this will be looked at in a moment. Our finds can be added to the already robust corpus of namestones known from Holy Island and recorded in the late Professor Dame Rosemary Cramp's corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture. For the purposes of time, I'll just point out a few key attributes of certain new namestones. In our first year of excavation, we found this round-headed top of a namestone. You can see its thickness from the inset image where I'm holding it up. We are looking here at the upper 2 quadrants of a central incised cross that would have looked similar to another more complete namestone, which you can see on the right. The composition is framed by a double incised border through which the end terminals of the cross arms protrude. The inscription has been interpreted by Elizabeth Okasha as an entirely new personal name in Old English, Ithfrith, while the second element, the frith, is found in numerous Anglo-Saxon male names. The first element, the rare one, has 1 occurrence, and it's a female name from the Durham Liber Vitae. Visually, this namestone's layout mimics manuscript folia. See, for example, this page from the Sacramentarium Galasianum on the right, an 8th century manuscript said to have been used by Boniface himself. Moreover, above the main line of text, there's also 2 faint letter forms on either side of the circle, marking the termination of the top cross arm. This can be read as an A and W, although the letter read as a W is actually set on its side and has its loops closed, making it superficially resemble a B. This is the abbreviation for Alpha and Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, referenced in the Book of Revelation. The pair of letters is often combined with a cross or chi-rho, and here again the sacramentary folio we have on the right provides a visual link. There we have an alpha and omega dangling from the cross arms, as seen in many late antique and early medieval, especially Byzantine, manuscript art and metalwork from the continent. I suggest that our namestone then places its cross and name within an architectural setting. The curve of the border on the namestone mimics the springing of the curve on the arch within which the cross stands on the manuscript page. Lastly, note the recessed roundel which would have delineated the center of the crossed head. This area of sunken relief likely held some sort of inset, perhaps glass or metal. An inset would have given the little piece animacy. Flickering light and shadow would have bounced off it, visually plain with any colored pigments painted upon it. There are plenty of other manuscript parallels which can be drawn with the form and composition of namestones. Namestones are in essence stone folia, themselves like a little manuscript page. Take, for example, the layout of the cross carpet page, the one I said we would feature again, which faces the opening to St. Jerome's letter to Pope Damasus. You can probably just make out the novum opus on the right hand or the recto page. Here we see a central cross with squared terminals, jewel-like in appearance and color. Are the two squares above and two rectangles below themselves in the place of the inscriptions on a namestone? Heavily stylized, aniconic, so are they depictions of Alpha and Omega, or sun and moon above, and Mary and John below? Similarly, could we read the inscriptions on either side of the namestone's cross as the named individuals, likewise waiting, watching, and praying at the cross? The lovely interlace-filled border of a new namestone has close parallel to a regula of St. Benedict from Tegernsee in Bavaria. We only have part of the namestone, so we can look to the folio, the far right of the screen. See the incipit textus spaced out as if the scribe is imaging the letters being breathed into words within the architectural space. Could our namestones have acted as prayers in stone? Could they visualize the sonic, the spoken name of the deceased being uttered by those who came to the grave in remembrance, carved in stone so as to carry on that prayer long after the sound of bodied chant had ended? This is, of course, all phenomenological conjecture, but nevertheless important, given that namestones were part of a vibrant multimedia world. Holy Island would surely have had a monumental cross or two, like the Rupertus cross, a processional cross of gilded bronze on maple, which made its way to Salzburg, where it resides to this day. We here again have the square terminals of the cross arms marked out with circles, as well as similar roundels down the cross shaft, something that we see on many of our Lindisfarne namestones. Liturgical objects like this would without doubt have had a home on Lindisfarne. And I've only included a picture of myself in that image because when I went to see the cross in person, it was much larger than anticipated. It's quite a monumental metal, a wood cross cloaked in metal. So definitely would play counterpoint to monumental sculptures. This namestone, found in rubble in 2018, gives us the lower right-hand quadrant, again of a namestone. The cross base is visible as a half semicircle infilled with interlace. The first line of visible text is the end of some sort of runic inscription, the first part of which is broken off. The second line of surviving text gives us the second element of a personal name in Old English, N. Wulf. Wulf is a frequently attested personal name element, just think of Beowulf. However, I don't find the inscription to be what's most interesting about the piece. Instead, I'm particularly taken with this little fragment because when I held it to better light a few summers ago, I was able to make out two parallel lines below the second line of text. Can you see them? Here I've delineated them with red arrows. It's as if the piece was either A, left unfinished, the space was ruled out in preparation for another line of text to be added, as we see in manuscripts and that common practice of pricking and ruling. Here's an example in the Aberdeen bestiary. Or maybe the segment of the inscription was painted rather than carved. It's another good reminder that we're looking at multimedia art objects. A namestone carved on two faces was unearthed in 2022. It was found in a rubbly layer in the same trench, that is Trench 2 East, as the last namestone we'll look at in a moment. Spectacularly, it's one of only two namestones carved on both faces, the other example being Lindisfarne 27, imaged here. We need our linguists to look at it more closely, but my working hypothesis is that we're seeing at least two periods of use, or reuse rather, maybe a generation apart. Take a look at how the bookhand on one side, with wedge-shaped serifs, that's on the left-hand side, contrasts with the lightly, or the left-hand image, contrasts with the lightly incised lines of the other side's inscription, your image on the right. Look too at the differences in the large central crosses. This piece is key in helping us ask questions about use and reuse. We have far more burials than we do namestones. They were clearly made for special individuals. Like a focal burial, might individuals have wanted to be buried close to someone associated with a namestone? Could namestones have even marked out familial connections? A final namestone that we'll look at is this one. It's the thickest one we found and the closest we've got to a secure archaeological context. In form, it bears some resemblance to one of the namestones already known prior to our excavations, and that's what's the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture calls Lindisfarne 29. And I'll note that all of The corpus sculptures that I'm referring to and the numbers that they're given are all accessible online. The corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture has a website where you can search, use a drop-down menu, look by volume. All of these sculptures will be in the first volume, the volume that was published in 1984 on County Durham and Northumberland. It was Rosemary Cramp's first publication in that series. So I encourage you to look at that website. Of course, you can also access the print volumes, and Durham is home to the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture. So I've been very lucky to be able to engage with some of the finest minds in early medieval archaeology who've worked on sculpture with the corpus. The image on the left on this slide is of Julie holding the stone right where she found it, this name stone that we saw right there on the left-hand side. She found it in the stone lining south of a burial in our East Trench. The image on the right is to remind you where that burial is. It happens to be our focal burial. While we can't directly say that this stone is associated with this individual, the primary burial, that is the bottom burial, came back with C14 dates with a 90% probability from AD 771 to 978. So possibly within that original namestone territory, if we're looking at an 8th century on epigraphic grounds date for the namestone. So that's quite exciting. David also told me that I'm allowed to say tonight that within that burial, we actually found a piece or pieces of gold thread, which were an amazing find last year. A student found them, and the joke is when we were on site, we had come back from lunch and someone thought it was just bits of a jumper, someone's sweater that had blown into the trench, and fantastically it wasn't, and it was actually gold. And so the question becomes, is this part of some sort of kind of head garment? Is this a thread that would have gone on to some sort of piece of apparel? So we need to learn more about the individuals within. I should say there are multiple individuals within both the shrine burial and the chest burial. We see multiple phases of use, and children in the case of the shrine burial, a child being buried on top of two adults. So there's a lot more questions to unpack here. Here's an image again of that namestone, just so you can see again the context. And Julie, I asked if she very kindly in this photograph held the namestone where she found it. So again, probably not in situ. It's fallen in, but it's exciting because this is the closest we've got to a namestone that is more firmly within the funerary environs. Moving away from namestones, we've got a variety of other sculpture fragments. That includes this strange red sandstone fragment found in 2021, which looks a bit namestone-ish. Can you make out the motif carved in very lightly incised lines on its surface? Here it is in a bright neon green, a large circle crossed by a saltire, that is an X-shaped cross. The points where the circle and cross meet are delineated by smaller circles. We haven't found anything like this before, and there are no immediate parallels, at least in the sculpture world. There's nothing that jumps out when looking at the Inchmarnock trial or motif pieces. And I'll note here that Inchmarnock is an island in the Firth of Clyde, with some of you might be familiar with, which has a monastery that was established in the 7th century and an important assemblage of these trial or motif pieces. Sometimes we see an artist working out a design on a fragment of stone or bone before they move on to carving the real piece. But this fragment has that deliberately curved top. The only real sculpture parallel is from St. Fergus's Church in Dice in Aberdeenshire, but it's certainly not like for like. And the uniqueness of this monument, this little monument, might in itself be important. If we return to manuscripts, there's lots of food for thought. Take, for example, the prophets and evangelists in orthogonal positions on that folio from the mid-9th century Alcuin Bible. The central Agnus Dei is indeed crossed by a saltire, which, if it went past the diamond enclosure, would head towards or through the prophet-inhabited roundels. Geometric designs, among them roundels and crossing shapes, are indeed integral to carpet pages, including that of the Book of Durrow, circa AD 700. Or take the Book of Kells, circa AD 800. What we have on the sandstone slab is, in essence, a circular version of this page. In the manuscript, the elements are diamonds and squares, where our example has circles, but the idea might be the same. So is someone planning out a manuscript page? It might be pushing it too far to jump to the conclusion that we're getting some sort of archaeological evidence of an early medieval scriptorium. And certainly we know that Lindisfarne was the site of important manuscript production, as you know, is most exemplified in the Lindisfarne Gospels. But this is just an interesting kind of pointer as to that wider material culture with which these objects are interacting. And I'll note too that there were two other excavations on Lindisfarne, one in the 1960s by Brian Hope Taylor that did not unearth any sculpture fragments, quite small scale, and then another led by Deirdre O'Sullivan and Leicester University. And the work that they did at Green Shield, they dug up a lot of 10th century cattle bone, which has gone towards discussions as to obviously cattle being used in manuscript production as vellum. So things to consider. I also think, interestingly, on this little fragment, that there's a faint linear frame etched around the central incised design on the slab. I don't know if you can make it out on your slide, and it's probably easiest to see if your screen is larger. But the point is this: if the design is indeed framed by a line, then we're again not off target to be thinking about manuscript parallels. As I said, Lindisfarne was, after all, the home of a scriptorium. Or could the stone be some sort of cosmological diagram, like those in St. John's College, Oxford, MS 17, or British Library, Harley 3667? The inset image is from the St. John's manuscript, from a complex diagram entitled De Concordia Mentium Atque Elementorum, that describes the interrelationship of the elements of the universe. Or is this simply a homemade grave slab? And I don't say simply lightly. There's something intimate and hastily done about the piece, as if it isn't even made to be seen by you and me, but rather placed in the grave with someone. We just don't know, and unfortunately, the context of this little monument, because it was in upper disturbed layers that we've now since closed, doesn't offer much to the discussion. I talked once with Nancy Edwards about the possibility it could be a homemade grave slab, maybe for a child. She's seen possibly a similar example in Wales. So lots of questions remain, but it's a lovely piece that I think engages with something so personal and intimate. And again, as I said, there's that hasty nature to it, which I find rather moving. And maybe one more thing I'll add, because I have a little bit of time. I was speaking with a Stanford Classics professor a couple of years ago, and he talked about his interest is in China in the 3rd century, and he was talking about Chinese texts that talk about early feng shui and planning out space. In that case, you know, we know today that idea of kind of planning out furniture in a space, but his question was, is this planning out space in some way within maybe the cemetery environs? Now I know that 3rd century China is not 8th century Lindisfarne, but some of these ideas I think are important to kind of throw out. Another monument was found in 2 pieces, rather miraculously a season apart, and the bottom segment was found a year before the top segment. The top segment was actually holding down, I think, a tarp when it was found, and thankfully one of the Dig Ventures employees, Indy, turned it over and saw it had carving on it. Put together, we get this composition: 3 crosses, a smaller cross on each side of a large central Latin cross. Thanks to corpus editor Dr. Derek Craig's seemingly photographic memory, he suggested parallels in Galloway in southwest Scotland. This includes an example from Whithorn, seen on the right. The arrangement is called a Golgotha format. The New Testament's Passion narrative recounts Christ being crucified with an individual on either side. Upon closer inspection, I noted that there's a slight bulge on the central cross, marked with a red arrow on this slide. I think this is calling to mind the collar of 9th century freestanding crosses. If so, then there's something deliberate at work here. The world of the present, with known liturgical objects of the here and now, is being inserted into the biblical narrative of the past. This merging of past and present is also, I would argue, seen in the fact that the 2 crosslets each have different cross heads. I think we can make out curved armpits to the cross, maybe a ringed cross on the left-hand side, versus the one on the right, which very clearly has the right angles of an equal-armed Latin cross. So there appears to be some sort of personalization of, and maybe even temporal creativity with the biblical scene at hand. I'll here mention C.R. Piers again, this time his excavations at Whitby. There he and Radford unearthed 2 cross bases, possibly in situ, next to one another, to the north of the north transept of the standing abbey. These cross spaces are both recorded on the site plan seen here and taken from their publication in 1943. The close proximity of the two cross spaces and the slightly lower positioning of the smaller cross space could, to my mind, indicate a monumentalized Golgotha format, perhaps the type recorded by the nun Hunenberg in a description of the Holy Land. A third cross space, possibly holding a wooden cross, as the extant right-hand socket suggests, could have accompanied the other two high crosses to form a triad on the headland. We do know from the extant cross spaces on the Hjöf, the rocky promontory at Holy Island, that promontory locations are known for having had early medieval high crosses, and that's often where we'll find cross spaces still in situ. I'm thinking Aldheim has an example of that. I'll skip this for now. It was another fragment found last year, right after I had left site. It always happens that when you leave site, nice things are found. I know David Petz feels that way very much when he's just gone for a day. The Whitby cross bases have opened up our discussion to freestanding, monumental, cruciform stone sculptures, what we can term a high cross. As we've seen, they are part of this wider sculpture world on Holy Island. And I'll draw your attention to the fact that this image was taken of the redisplay at the Lindisfarne Priory Museum. I took this when I was on site in September 2023 digging, but it's well worth a visit and a good example of how putting sculptures in the round, in this case being able to walk around the crosses or the cross fragments, makes a massive difference. Before they were plastered against the wall and you had no sense of their three-dimensionality and kind of circumambulating these monuments. The best example, obviously, of a display to my mind is that at Iona, where you can circumambulate the crosses and have a sense of the passing of the day and the sounds of different times of the day and how the light and shadow would reflect at sunrise and sunset. So anyway, just kind of to give you a note that the Priory Museum has been redisplayed and to go visit if you're in Northumberland. We need only to look at the broad chronological distribution of Lindisfarne's high crosses to see that the sheer percentage that are produced during the post, just to see the sheer percentage that are produced during the post 793 period, that is even without any excavation. Indeed, high crosses are the island's primary form of sculpture investment in the 9th century onwards. They are also the dominant form of investment at sculpture producing sites associated with the community of Cuthbert. Even without the excavated evidence, as I said, we do not see an island community in decline. We see them investing in a changing socio-political world. And I'll note that this graphic uses cast dates, although after doing a PhD on the distribution of high crosses across Britain and having continued chats with the likes of Victoria Thompson and others, I challenged some of the cast dates, and in particular, the evidence for early, that is 7th or 8th century, what I term band A, that yellow band. It's just a way that I made sense of chronological variation in my thesis. The evidence for early fragments is, to my mind, very limited, if not non-existent on Lindisfarne. This is a roughed out crosshead found in a trench we opened in 2021 when we were trying to determine the extent of the cemetery. And we determined there is no extent to the cemetery. It goes, continues to go quite far, possibly even going to the bay's edge. So there's a lot of work. We won't obviously we can't excavate that all, but basically it was proven that the cemetery doesn't end. This crosshead was reused in some sort of lining, but as the area is so disturbed and plowed out, it's impossible to determine the particular burial with which it might have been associated. And as my PhD showed, it's not uncommon to get cross components reused as grave fill or grave lining from the early medieval period onwards. And I'll also note that there was an excavation on the Hjöf it was Heritage Lottery funded, and it occurred in the first year of when our excavation was going on, and they found a grave within which a cross shaft was located. Within the wider corpus of material, that's not unusual, but it's exciting, obviously, for the purpose of dating things within a somewhat closed archaeological context. The pink circle on the image on the upper left of your screen delineates the area that has been deliberately pecked and is slightly circular in shape. What we're seeing here is probably the armpits of a crosshead Yes, armpits is the technical term. The cross would have either been orientated like the one at Warkworth in the upper right or Woodhorn in the lower right, both nearby along the northern Northumbrian coast. What accounts for the crosshead's undressed surface? Possibly we're seeing a monument that broke during construction or was deemed maybe not good enough to be dressed. On stylistic grounds, this type of crosshead usually dates to the later 10th or early 11th centuries, so its use, or reuse rather, in a Norman burial soon after initial construction seems likely. In 2021, we also found this fantastic cross shaft fragment. It was found in a highly disturbed plough soil layer in the Western Trench, and it was found by Mary, who I will never forget her delight in finding it and the fact that I was on site and got to share in that joy. It's the right angle where broad and narrow faces meet, one side bordered by a single incised line and the other by a double incised line. This slide shows examples of similarly bordered cross shafts. We see a single incised line on a shaft from Jarrow and double incised borders on shafts at Lindisfarne and Escombe in Northumberland and Durham, and Warren Percy in Eastern Yorkshire. All of these examples are dated early by Cass. There's also that fragment of unknown provenance from Northumberland, which is in the lower left-hand side of your screen. Whilst we cannot always rely on the fact that progress is a movement from simple to complex designs, I do think we have enough evidence amassed to place this new Lindisfarne fragment in an earlier period. I would also argue that our new fragment might have been the panel for geometric or figural ornament, as we see here on a cross-shaft fragment from Aberlady, though I'm more tempted to think the latter, as there's so much open space between border and interior. The cross-shaft fragments I've included from Wearmouth and Lindisfarne on the right of your screen show they themselves have geometric designs that abut or come up right to the border, again, making me think that this possibly might have had a figural design or else was plain entirely in the middle of the incised border. So our newly excavated cross components can be added to our island high cross chronology. There's a lot of scope for work to be done on the high cross assemblages associated with the wider community of Cuthbert. Norham's burst of high cross production seems to align with at least part of the community being based at that site, and Victoria has written about links with Jedburgh. But we also need to consider a site like Workington in Cumbria, where an already robust assemblage of 10th and 11th century cross components was nearly doubled, 7 to 13, through excavations from 1995 to 1997, so well past the date of that corpus volume. We need to think about how high crosses function differently at different sites, even those associated with the community of Cuthbert from the 9th century on. At Lindisfarne, we have a multifocal site employing high crosses in a variety of ways, as routeway markers, as focal points for liturgical activity, and even, I would argue, as navigational aids. The early medieval textual record certainly backs up a variety of locations for high crosses, with the emphasis always being on their human scale, place-making functions. But that's its own lecture. With that, I'd like to thank you for attending this talk, and I hope that you'll make it out to Holy Island while we dig again this September. And a final thank you to all those who've made the sculptures come alive in the field, for their joy and discovery, which heartens me daily. They are as much a part of Lindisfarne's sculpture story as the past. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christina. If you can downsize your screen, we'll move on to some questions. And just as a reminder, if you could put any questions you have into the chat box, we will get to them. We've got a few minutes left for that, so that would be great. So just while you're thinking about those teasing, incisive things you wish to ask, I will ask Christina just one question I have, and it's a question asked probably from ignorance, because sculpture is not something I know anything about really. But I was really intrigued with your name stones and the sort of central inset, which you suggested might have had something inserted into it. Do we actually have any evidence from anywhere what that might be, or any insight?
Excellent question. There was an article published a few years ago by Alice Blackwell at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and she has found evidence for tin inlay in the eyes of the figural imagery on a cross shaft, the one that I showed actually from Aberlady in southeast Scotland. And the tin inlay would indicate some sort of kind of stone or metal or glass inset. So we do have that evidence. There's evidence of that on other sculptures as well, quite excitingly. So we do know that these were multimedia objects, and there's current work going on looking at painting on the monuments. So they definitely were not just the stone that we see now that can appear quite flat. And at the same time, though, there's a beauty when you see the sculptor's hand at work and how they used a particular, the geology of a particular stone, and you can see how they've brought that out in their carving. I'm thinking of an example from Hotham of a relief recumbent cross slab. Anyway.
You actually anticipated my follow-up question, which was about painting, whether there was evidence of pigment. I mean, I know almost certainly not, because the stones are in secondary context and worn or whatever else. But I think that's a really interesting point about whether they were, painted and decorated in lively ways.
And there is evidence for that. Someone at Durham is working right now on that. So there's bits and pieces, but it is difficult when we're working with monuments that have had very varied monument biographies and a lot of lives that postdated their early medieval use.
No, fully understandable. Anyway, I'll hand over to Rachel. Do we have questions in the chat box, Rachel?
We do indeed have questions. Lots of people, Christina, saying what a fantastic talk it was, to which I will add my voice too. Lots of food for thought, and I'm sure I'll be in contact. Anne P has a couple of questions. Apologies, Anne, I don't know your surname. She starts off with, some of the stones have equal-armed cross with an extension to be lower arm, terminating in a semicircular base. Is this common, and do you think there's a reason for this style?
Some of the crosses on what? Sorry, can I ask for?
I don't know. That's what she said. Some of the stones. So some of the stones have an equal-armed cross with an extension to, I guess, the lower arm, terminating in a semicircular base.
Yeah, there's some. I think maybe what is this? Anne is thinking of is in the west of Scotland and in Ireland, you'll sometimes get that form. I'm not sure if there's I wouldn't say there's a particular reason other than you'll see different kind of regional variations on the cross form. And sometimes, as I said, you'll see the alpha and omega underneath. I'm not entirely sure what monument you're referring to, Anne, so I think you're thinking of Western material from the west of Scotland and Ireland, kind of the Irish Sea world.
I suspect she is, because her other question was, is there a comparison to be made with the Isle of Man cross stones?
Yes. Yes. I think it depends in Britain where you are and what crosses you're dealing with. Those monuments are interesting because obviously their chronology is later. They're more slab-like in appearance. They have resemblance to material that you see in the southwest of Scotland, unsurprisingly, given the closeness of the southwest of Scotland to the Isle of Man. But yes, lots of food for thought there and discussion. I think they have less bearing upon our northern Northumbrian kind of east North Sea kind of world stylistically.
Oh, that's brilliant, Christina. Thank you very much. Whilst we're on this kind of subject of the stones, because obviously a lot of them are kind of broken and they're in kind of reused contexts, how kind of quickly are they sort of broken up? And are we talking kind of within like a century of their creation that they're being deposited, or is it kind of like a longer kind of more complex biography?
That's chapter 5 of my thesis. That's a great question. And something I was surprised by, kind of one of the conclusions I drew, was we tend to associate iconoclasm with Reformation. And whilst the early modern period does bring destruction, there, as Deirdre O'Sullivan herself has talked about, the Norman conquest brought a lot of destruction. A lot of monuments were destroyed at that period of time. But I've also been noting instances of early medieval destruction of the monuments themselves. I think Carly's writing at something at Port Mahomet. Yeah, Port Mahomet has a very clear, thank you, Carly, very clear evidence of early medieval destruction of monuments that are being destroyed not long after their creation. Port Mahomet is a fantastic site. Only one, but no high crosses. There, I would separate out upright relief cross slabs from Carly's beat me to it, as being a different monument form. So much to the chagrin of, I think, Martin Carver on that one. So it's not to take away from those monuments, but just to say it's a different monumental tradition.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And finally, I think we've got a question from Fiona Campbell-Howes on a different type of material culture. She's said she really enjoyed the talk. She's curious about the white quartz pebbles placed in the graves. Is there anything you can say about that as a practice, and does it have a known meaning?
Excellent. Thanks for that question, Fiona. It's not in the textual record. We see it at other sites, especially in the north of England, in Scotland. It seems to be a practice that kind of originates sometime in the Iron Age and trickles through to the early medieval period. I mean, there's discussions on kind of the quality of quartz as being a pebble that you can kind of strike together. It has that kind of milky white, kind of diaphanous quality. So there are, discussions on kind of that phenomenological kind of effect of the pebbles. But what's interesting, and this hopefully will maybe shed some light on Fiona's question, they are not found on island. Over the years, we spent time going to the shore and trying to find them. We, meaning dig venturers, Durham Uni folk like myself, and we can't find any, which indicates that either they've all been taken during the early medieval period, or, as is more likely the case, they would have been brought from off island, brought onto the island. So there's that intentional act of bringing them and then setting them on or within a grave, much like the Jewish tradition of putting a pebble or a stone on or near a grave. But there's deep symbolism, obviously, to stones and in both the Old and the New Testament. So it's, again, leaves more questions than answers, but it's not the only site to have that.
That thing that's sorry, Kristen, there is one other, so quickly scanning through the questions. It all came as a flood at the end. And I'm going to really show my ignorance of place names now, so I'm going to completely mangle this. So apology, Marion Wood. But Christina, could you tell me where the cross marked in Cornwall is? I'm trying to find any examples near Howgill Bude. So yeah, I think you mentioned a cross that's marked in from Cornwall, maybe.
Did I mention a Cornish cross?
Perhaps that was one for later, but yeah.
There I should say there are many crosses, and if you send me an email, I'll be able to specifically answer your question. I'm not sure, Phil. I would be happy to answer something more specific. Certainly, Cornwall has a tradition of, if you're talking about freestanding, like monumental crosses, a later tradition, as in 10th, 11th century, post-dating a lot of Lindisfarne's contribution. If you can be a little bit more specific, I'd be happy to obviously answer over email. I'm not even remembering. You've got me. I don't remember mentioning something Cornish, but
I think it was on one of your distribution maps.
Okay. Yes. So I didn't say it out loud. I need to go back and look then.
And yeah, thank you, Marion, for correcting me. Puffill Bude. Again, blame my sort of Mercian kind of bias. So apologies for that, Marion.
I'll write this down. Thank you, Marion. Okay.
Well, fantastic. Well, if that's all the questions, Rachel, I think we had a fantastic talk from you, Christina. We actually had some really interesting questions too. And the white pebbles actually sprung up in my mind, but I'm not going to go into it here because I know we're about to be out of time. But there's been interesting stuff from Wales as well. We had a talk about St. Patrick's Chapel with a very similar phenomenon connected potentially to pilgrimage and commemoration and that sort of thing. So, but anyway.
Can I say that that's also where a small slab that Nancy Edwards has drawn comparison with to our little namestone-ish, inscribed stone, where it was found, and in conjunction with the burial of a child. Sorry, it's the St. Patrick's Chapel site.
Yeah, well, it's almost as if we deliberately join up our talks, Christina, so there's a coherency between them. But no, there are many fascinating connections between these often disparate sites, certainly those in the sort of insular area of influence. So, but I think on that point, we will thank Christina for her fantastic talk and give her a virtual round of applause. I can see Karen is applauding in a very sunny looking location.
My mother.
Oh, was that your mum?
Yeah.
I've been looking at her little photo on the screen thinking, I wish I was there. It looks a lot nicer than here at the moment.
Aw, Pacific Northwest.
But thank you to our speaker. Thank you all to attending. We will be getting in touch about our next talk imminently, which will be after Easter, which is why we have a slight delay. But otherwise, it's been marvellous to see you. It's been marvellous to see our speaker. And thank you once again. Good night.